Today's daf is daf Lamed Zayin, and we're 5 lines down from the top of the Yomi. And we had a statement of Rav Dimi in interpreting the Shita of Rabbi Yochanan that Heter Mitztaref L'Isa applies to Nazir, and that we derive from Mishras, but it does not apply to any other Isurim. And Abai had barraged Rav Dimi with a number of kashas, mostly from Truma, to prove that the principle of Heter Mitztaref L'Isa applies even to other Isurim. Amalei Abaye Mimai Dahai Mishras Leheter Mitztaref L'Isa Hudiyasa. Now Abaye is asking another kash on Rav Dimi. The Shita Rabbi Yochanan in the transmission of Rav Dimi is that from Mishras we derive the conclusion that Heter Mitztaref L'Isa and Isurei Nazir. Dilma, how do you know that? Perhaps Litain Tam Ki Iker Hudiyasa. That the thrust of this pasuk is coming to teach you that even when you don't have a mamoshus of Isur, you don't have the actual physical Isur, and all you have is something that received the tam of the Isur, that itself has the din of the Isur itself. So that, for example, if the Nazir would take a case of hanovim, of grapes, and he soaked the grapes in water, and now the mayim received the tam of the yayin, and now he drinks the mayim itself, then if we hold tam ki ikar, then you would get malchus for drinking that water, even though there's no mamoshes of yayin at all. That's the din of tam ki ikar. So Mishras, according to Abai's kasha, would be telling you that if you soaked grapes in water, the water receives the tam of the grapes, and the water itself becomes also like the grapes. However, the din of Heter Mitztaref L'Isa would not apply here, because Heter Mitztaref L'Isa only applies when you have the mamoshes. Now we could flip it around in order to demonstrate that these two dinim of Heter Mitztaref L'Isa and Tam Ki Ikar are two separate dinim. We can flip it around the other way. So again, when we have no mamoshes, then we have Tam Ki Ikar, but we don't have Heter Mitztaref L'Isa. Now we have a case where we could have Heter Mitztaref L'Isa without Tam Ki Ikar. For example, let's say he eats a half a zayis of Isur together with a half a zayis of Heter, and they're separate one from the other. There's no nesinas tam. Here we could only prohibit it midin Heter Mitztaref L'Isa, but not midin Tam Ki Ikar, because there was no nesinas tam. And it's also possible to have a situation where you'd have an overlap of both Tam Ki Ikar and Heter Mitztaref L'Isa simultaneously. For example, let's say you have a mixture of the Gufa Isur, not just Tam, but the Gufa Isur, together with Heter. Then if this Taroves adds up to a Kizayis, and let's say it's a large Taroves, and there's a Kizayis of Isur spread out in a larger Taroves in such a way that if he eats the entire Taroves, then he would have eaten a Kizayis B'chtei Achilas Pras. Then in such a case, you don't need, so just one second. In such a case, he ate a Kizayis Menisa B'chtei Achilas Pras, and then you don't need any din. But the case I wanted to point out would be a case where there's no Kizayis in this Taroves Kidei Achilas Pras. So he would be chayav for eating a Kizayis of this Taroves, number one, because of Tam Ki Ikar, because the Isur gives off tam to the heter, and number two, because of heter mitztarf le'Isur. So now the Gemara points out that there's something very strange. This is sort of like a digression before we get to an answer to defend the drasha and the derivation from Mishras of heter mitztarf le'Isur as opposed to tam ki'ikar. But now the Gemara just asks a side question, like a footnote. Ulabaye may karka kashale Mike dekamar of Dimi. Until this point, Abaye was objecting to Rav Dimi for limiting the principle of heter mitztarf le'Isur, and he wanted to prove that heter mitztarf le'Isur against Rav Dimi applies elsewhere, even beyond the confines of Nazir. Because lay kol halan tufta, and in order to prove that heter mitztarf le'Isur goes beyond the confines of Nazir, he asked them all these kashes, and now question mark. That Mishras is coming to teach us tam ki'ikar, and therefore there's no din, even in Nazir, of heter mitztarf le'Isur. And the Gemara answers, Basa d'shani le, after Rav Dimi gave all the answers that he gave to all the kashes and the objections that Abaye had raised, Amalei, now Abaye concedes defeat, and he says to Rav Dimi, okay, I'm on board with you. There's only in one Isur, namely in Nazir, do we have the chumrah of heter mitztarf le'Isur, but dilma litein tam ki'ikar udos. How do we derive this from Mishras? Maybe the case of Mishras is not where he soaked the pita in the yayin and he ate from the pita, but it's a case where he soaked grapes in the water and he only drank the water. And the Gemara now supports this interpretation of Mishras Hanovim from a Brisa in Sanya. When the Torah says Mishras, it's Litein Tam Ki'ikar. It teaches us the Tam Ki'ikar. So he soaked the grapes in the water and he drank the water, which has the Tam of the grapes. Shimshor Hanovim V'mayim V'yesh Bahem Tam Mayim Chayev. The Nazir will get Malchus for drinking Kazayis of the Mayim, because the Hanovim gave Tam into the Mayim received the Tam of Hanovim. And the Mayim therefore becomes Isur Atzmo. He's chayav for drinking kazayis of the water because of Tam Ki'ikar. Now the Brisa continues. Umikanat done means a kal v'chomer. L'kol Isur Shabbat Torah. That if Tam Ki'ikar applies in the case of Nazir, which is relatively kal, then certainly it has to apply in other Isurim, like in Kalayim and in Orla, as we'll see. Uman Nazir, I'm going to prove to you that Nazir is an Isur Kal. Shein Isur Ola. That when a person's Makabel Naziris, it's 30 days. After 30 days, it automatically becomes Mutter. Number two, there's another Kula in Nazir. V'yein Isur Hana. The Nazir is allowed to have Hana from Yayin, and this is Sugyan Erevin Adaf Chavav and Beis. Shema Arvim Eruve Tchumin LeNazir B'Yayin. And number three, a third Kula, a leniency in Nazir. V'yesh Heter L'Isuro, which means that he can go to a Chacham and he can be shoel on his Nazirus. And nevertheless, the Torah was machmer and said also about Tam Ki'ikar, that he's chayav for drinking the water that received the Tam from the Anovim, is Kelaya Kerem, that has all those three chumras. Number one, Isuro, Isur Olam. It's not just a 30-day period. Isuro, Isur Hano, he's not allowed to have benefit at all from Kelayim. And not only that, Ein Hetel Isura, you can't go to a Chacham to be Mate Kelayim. You say no din, Sheyosab Tam Ki'ikar, more so, there should be a din of Tam Ki'ikar. So we can certainly, from this Kal V'chomer, derive the din of Tam Ki'ikar in Isur Kelayim. And not only that, V'uad din li Arla. Again, Arla only has 2 out of the 3 of the chumras that we saw in Klaya Kerem. But B'shtayim, number one, it's an Isur Hano. You're not allowed to have any benefit from Arla. And number two, ein heteli suro. Right, that means during the 3-year period of time of Orla, it's osur, and you can't be matir it. It's not like the Orla has a time period that's limited, like Nazir, which has a 30 period cap. The third chomer of Kalayim, that does not apply to Orla, is that in the case of Kalayim, the Isur is an Isur Olam. You'll never ever be able to be matir Kalayim, no matter what you do, stand on your head. But with regard to the tree and its production of fruits, then after the 3rd year of its production of fruits, the peras are mutter. But 2 out of 3 is enough for a kal v'chomer. So getting back to this Bryce, so the Bryce is proving to us that Mishras is the source for Tam Kikar, but not for the din of Hetem and Starf L'Isur. And we're talking about Anovim that were soaked in Mayim, and he drinks the Mayim. It's therefore, how does Rabbi Yochanan know, back to square one, that Mishras is teaching me Hetem and Starf L'Isur? And the Gemara answers this kasha, Omer Le'ahu Merabanan, one of the Chacham says to Abaye, Rabbi Avo, who said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that from Mishras we derive Hetem and Starf L'Isur, Ki Ka'amar Rabbi Akiva. Don't ask me from the brisa that you just brought, that Mishras teaches me Tam Ki Ikar, because that brisa represents the Chachamim of Rabbi Akiva, whereas Rabbi Avo's statement in the name of Rabbi Yochanan represents Rabbi Akiva's Shita. Hey, Rabbi Akiva, which Rabbi Akiva? Ilema Rabbi Akiva dehachav. It's Rabbi Akiva v'ha Mishnah back on Daf Lamed Daled Amud Beis. Tisnan Rabbi Akiva Omer afilu shara pito b'yayin v'yesh bo k'dei l'tzaref kizayis chayav. It means that the yayin itself does not have a full shear of kizayis. And keep in mind that Rabbi Akiva holds that the shear of yayin for a nazir is kizayis and not revius. Normally, liquids have a shear of revius, but Rabbi Akiva holds that the shear of liquids of yayin is kizayis. And now, in this pas that he soaked in yayin, there's no kizayis of yayin. And nevertheless, Rabbi Akiva says he's chayav, and the reason for that is because of Hetem and Starf L'Isur, meaning that we're going to use the pas, he eats the pas, and the pas has a half a zayis plus the half a zayis of yayin, and together we make a full shear of kizayis. So the Gemara asks, you know what? I'm not sure that Rabbi Akiva had in mind Hetem and Starf L'Isur. We can interpret Rabbi Akiva's statement in that Mishnah in a different way. Umimai. Dilma, perhaps, who de ika kizayis b'yene. Rabbi Akiva is talking about a case where there's a full kizayis of yayin, and what happens is that when Rabbi Akiva says kidei l'tzaref kizayis, he doesn't mean that there's less than a kizayis of yayin, but rather what he means is that the yayin is absorbed in the pita, and we need to be mitzaref it and gather it all together to one shear of kizayis. There's no chiddush over here. If he's drinking a full kizayis' worth of yayin, so why does Rabbi Akiva have to tell me that he's chayav? Why would I think he's not chayav? And the Gemara answers this side point. Rabbi Akiva just wants to tell you that the shear of yayin for nazir is not a revius, as it is classic in liquids, but rather here it's a shear of kizayis. So now we're back to square one. How does Rabbi Akiva know that heter is mitzaref l'isur? Where is that Rabbi Akiva? It's certainly not Rabbi Akiva the Mishnah, because Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah is just telling you that the shear of yayin is kizayis. He doesn't tell you that heter mitzaref l'isur. The Gemara answers Rabbi Akiva de Brisa, not Rabbi Akiva of our Mishnah, but of the Brisa. The Sanya Rabbi Akiva Omer Nazir sheshora pita b'yayin v'yochel kizayis mipas u'miyayin chayav. If after soaking his bread in wine he eats a kezayis from both that's mitzvah, that's an integration of pas and yayin, he's chayav because heter mitzaref leisur. And this Rabbi Akiva derives from Mishras. Okay, now the Gemara wants to know, how does Rabbi Akiva derive the halach of tam ki'ika? Amalei Rav Achabrei Rav Avila Rav Ashi Rabbi Akiva de Kamokim le lahai kol Mishras lehetim tzarf leisur is litain tam ki'ika minole. Where, from whence does Rabbi Akiva derive the principle of tam ke'ikar? Meaning, if the pasuk in Nazir of Mishras is talking about a case where he soaks a pas in half a zayis of yayin, and he eats the combination of pas and yayin, how does Rabbi Akiva derive the conclusion that if he took grapes and soaked them in water, and he drank the water that received the time of the grapes, he'd be chayav? And the Gemara answers, Yolif mi basa b'cholav. Lav tamel b'almahu. You have, let's say, a tipas cholav that falls on basar, and if you eat that combination, you're chayav. And now the question is, why you chayav? I mean, you didn't have a shear of cholav here, you only had a small amount of cholav, but that tipas cholav spread throughout the entire piece of meat, and where is the cholav? It's not to be found. All you have here is the tam of cholav that was absorbed into the basar, and it's asur based on the principle of tam ki'ika. We can derive from basar v'cholav in kol tarkula tam is ki'ika. That's the Gemara's suggestion right now. What I don't understand here is, how do we know that basar b'cholav, there's only a small amount of cholav that penetrated into the basar? Maybe the Torah prohibits basar b'cholav when there was a shear of a kezayis of basar that was cooked with a shear of kezayis of meat. Just 1 second. I'm not sure that the Gemara is going to address this now. The Gemara is going to talk about whether it's a chidush or not. Just 1 second. So let's just assume the following. The Torah does not specify. The Torah just says he cooked cholav with basar. And what the Torah is telling me is that there's a tam of the cholav in the basar, and the tam of the basar in the cholav. It's not requiring a shear in the cholav or a shear of mamoshus in the basar. For Rabbanan. So why do Rabbanan feel that they need Nazir to prove and establish that tam is ki'ika? Why not derive it from basar b'cholav? And the Gemara answers, "Mi basar b'cholav lo gamrina de chidushu." The Torah is mechadesh a big chidush. My chidusho ilema dahai lechude v'hai lechude shari v'hadi adodi asur. If the chidush of basar b'cholav is because the basar is heter, right? It's kosher geshachted meat, and the cholav is mutter. It's a cholav of a parah, and yet the combination thereof creates an isur. Gemara says that's not a chiddush. We already have a precedent for that. Kilayim nami hay lechudei shari, hay lechudei shari, v'hadi adodi yaseh. What do you have in kilay hakerem? You have a kerem and you have tvua. So you have the geffen is mutter unto itself, and the tvua is mutter unto itself, but the combination thereof generates isur. So why did the Rabbanan refuse to derive tam ki'ika from basar b'cholav? Ella, but rather the Torah le kuliyoma b'chalava shari umevashal le bishulei asur. We have a principle in basar b'cholav that makes it a chiddush, and that is derech bishul asur Torah. You can soak a piece of meat in cholav for a full day. That's called kavush. And yet, on the Torah level, it's mutter. You can eat that combination because there was no bishul. And even though kavush is like mivishul, but that's only midrabanan. And the Torah requires bishul mamish. So that's a big chiddush. We don't find that in other isurim. And therefore, the Chachamim are of the opinion you cannot derive tam ki ikar from bas b'chov to other isurim. For Rabbi Akiva nami bas b'chol of chidushu. How then could Rabbi Akiva derive tam ki ikar from bas b'chol? It's a chidush. Ella says the Gemara. Now the Gemara retracts and admits that even Rabbi Akiva did not derive tam ki ikar from bas b'chol. Ella yolif migu ule aku.